today's stories, we will follow a millionaire who took his son on Everest, but they both died. Faced with clear medical warnings that his son was failing, he overruled the guide and pushed higher. The decision was so shockingly stubborn that it would cost more than either of them understood. It was May 18, 2016. The summit push window on Mount Everest had opened just days earlier, and the South Col route was crowded with climbers eager to reach the top. At 26,000 feet on the South Col, more than 50 climbers from a dozen expeditions were preparing for their summit attempts. Gerald Huxley was 54 years old, a millionaire from Boulder, Colorado, who had made his fortune in commercial real estate development across the Mountain West region. He had built and sold a portfolio of shopping centers and office complexes over 25 years, finally liquidating everything 3 years earlier. The sale had left him with more money than he could spend. Retirement didn't suit him. He needed goals, challenges, something to work toward. Everest became that goal. For months, he hired consultants to evaluate expedition companies, paid experienced climbers for advice sessions, and had specialists create detailed training and equipment plans. He told friends and family during a gathering that he and his son Russell would be climbing Everest together the following spring. Russell Huxley was 21 years old. He dropped out of a private university 18 months earlier after failing multiple classes and losing interest in his business degree. Since then, he'd been drifting, traveling through Southeast Asia for months, working briefly at a ski resort in Colorado, then spending 4 months in South America. All of it was funded by his father's money. Russell was athletic and naturally coordinated, drawn to activities that provided immediate thrills: surfing, rock climbing, mountain biking, base jumping. But he lacked discipline and follow-through. He would obsess over something for weeks, then abandon it completely. When Gerald proposed they climb Everest together, Russell's initial reaction was skepticism. He had no serious mountaineering experience. He'd climbed Kilimanjaro on a guided trek 2 years earlier, a 10-day trip that required no technical skills. But Gerald was insistent. This would be their shared achievement, the thing that bonded them, the story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. Russell agreed, not because he wanted to climb Everest, but because saying no to his father had never been a realistic option. They hired an expedition company and began training several months before departure. Gerald hired a personal trainer who specialized in high-altitude preparation and had a custom program designed for both of them. They trained at altitude in Colorado, spending weekends above 14,000 feet. They practiced using crampons, ice axes, and fixed ropes at a climbing facility. Gerald followed the program obsessively, treating missed workouts like business failures. Russell trained inconsistently. He'd go hard for a week, then skip sessions when he lost motivation. By the time they left for Nepal, Gerald was in the best shape of his life. Russell was fit but underprepared. They spent 6 weeks acclimatizing, making multiple trips up and down the mountain to allow their bodies to adapt to the thinning air. Neither man had ever climbed above 20,000 feet before arriving in the Himalayas. Their guide was an experienced mountaineer who had summited Everest 11 times over 15 years. Mount Everest's summit sits at 29,029 feet, well into what climbers call the death zone, an altitude where the human body cannot acclimatize and begins shutting down from oxygen deprivation. At that elevation, every step requires monumental effort. The heart races to pump oxygen-depleted blood. The lungs heave but cannot extract enough oxygen from the thin air. The body cannot recover or adapt. It can only deteriorate. Most climbers use supplemental oxygen above 26,000 feet, but even with it, physical and cognitive function decline rapidly. Their guide expressed concerns from the beginning of the acclimatization process. During the first rotation to the second camp at 21,000 feet in mid-April, Russell struggled significantly. The climb from base camp took him nearly 8 hours, roughly 2 hours longer than average. He arrived at camp exhausted, with a severe headache and nausea. His oxygen saturation was measured at 72%, low but not critical. The guide recommended they descend the next morning and rest for several days. Gerald disagreed. He noted that Russell's oxygen saturation had been 75% at base camp, so the current reading wasn't much worse. He argued that Russell just needed time to adjust. They stayed at the second camp for an additional night. Russell's condition improved slightly, and they descended on the third day. The guide made a note in his expedition log that Russell was acclimatizing slower than expected and might not be ready for a summit attempt. During the second rotation in late April, they climbed to the third camp at 23,500 feet. Russell developed a persistent cough and reported feeling dizzy when he stood up quickly. The guide examined him and suspected early signs of pulmonary edema, fluid beginning to accumulate in his lungs. He recommended Russell descend immediately and consider ending his expedition. Gerald refused to accept that assessment. He pointed out that Russell wasn't coughing up pink frothy sputum, which would indicate severe pulmonary edema. He insisted Russell was just experiencing normal altitude effects. Gerald paid for additional oxygen bottles, 6 extra beyond what the expedition company provided. He also hired an additional climbing assistant, whose sole job would be to help Russell during the summit push. The guide agreed to continue but documented his concerns in writing, and had both Gerald and Russell sign an acknowledgement that they were proceeding against medical advice. On May 17th, the team moved from the third camp to the fourth camp on the South Col at 26,000 feet. The fourth camp is essentially a collection of tents perched on a barren, windswept plateau of rock and ice. Most climbers spend less than 12 hours there, just enough time to rest briefly before the summit push. The weather forecast showed a narrow window of opportunity, clear skies and relatively low winds on May 18th, but a storm system moving in from the west by the evening of the 19th. Multiple expedition teams were planning to summit on the 18th, which meant the route would be crowded. The guide advised a conservative approach, begin the summit attempt at 9 p.m. on May 17th, which would put them on top around dawn if everything went perfectly. More importantly, he established a firm turnaround time of 1 p.m. on May 18th, regardless of their position on the mountain. The turnaround time was non-negotiable, whether they were 100 feet from the summit or 1,000 feet. If they weren't already descending by 1 p.m., they would turn around. Gerald challenged this. He wanted to start earlier, at 8 p.m. instead of 9 p.m., to ensure they had maximum time. He argued that with the extra oxygen bottles he'd purchased and the additional climbing assistant, they had more margin than other teams. The guide explained that starting earlier wouldn't necessarily mean summiting earlier. It would just mean they'd be climbing during the coldest part of the night and potentially wearing themselves out. But Gerald was insistent. After a long discussion, the guide reluctantly agreed to an 8 p.m. departure, but emphasized the 1 p.m. turnaround time even more strongly. By the time they began gearing up at 7:30 p.m. on the May 17th, Russell was already exhausted. His movements were slow and uncoordinated. He fumbled with his harness buckles and needed help clipping his carabiners correctly. Gerald appeared energized despite the lack of sleep. He checked his watch obsessively and kept recalculating their pace. He'd mapped out specific waypoints and times they needed to hit to stay on schedule for a safe descent, factoring in the turnaround time the guide had established. At 8:15 p.m., they left camp and began the final ascent. Gerald, Russell, the guide, and the additional climbing assistant all clipped into the fixed ropes and started climbing. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusts reached 40 miles per hour, strong enough that climbers had to stop moving and brace themselves when the strongest gusts hit. Above them, a line of headlamps from dozens of other climbers snaked up the mountain, everyone racing toward the same goal during the same narrow weather window. The climb progressed slower than Gerald had calculated. The route was severely congested with climbers bottlenecked at the fixed ropes. By 11 p.m., they'd been climbing for nearly 3 hours but had only gained about 800 feet. They were behind schedule. Gerald grew visibly impatient. He started pushing past other teams whenever the terrain allowed it, moving off the fixed ropes to climb on unprotected ground. This was technically possible, but significantly more dangerous. A slip without being clipped to the rope meant an uncontrolled fall. Russell followed mechanically, doing whatever his father did. The guide repeatedly called out for them to stay on the fixed ropes, but Gerald ignored him. By 2 a.m., they had reached a plateau called the Balcony at 27,500 feet. The balcony is a relatively flat section where climbers typically stop to change oxygen bottles and assess their condition. Russell was moving mechanically, his steps uneven and his breathing labored, even with supplemental oxygen flowing at 2 liters per minute. When they stopped at the balcony, Russell immediately sat down in the snow. He didn't speak, he just sat staring at the ground. The guide checked Russell's oxygen supply and found he was consuming it faster than planned. Each oxygen bottle should last approximately 4 hours at 2 liters per minute. Russell had gone through his first bottle in 3.5 hours. The guide checked Russell's pupils with a headlamp. They were reactive but sluggish. The guide stated clearly that they needed to turn back. Russell's oxygen consumption rate meant they wouldn't have enough for both the ascent and descent. More concerning, Russell's slow responses suggested early cerebral edema. Gerald checked his watch and calculated that they were 30 minutes behind his planned pace, but could make it up. He stated they were continuing. Russell offered no opinion. He just sat in the snow. They changed oxygen bottles and resumed climbing at 2:25 a.m. The route from the balcony to the south summit gets progressively steeper and more exposed. The terrain angles up at 40 to 50 degrees in places, steep enough that climbers are bent forward, pulling themselves upward hand over hand along the fixed ropes. A fall here would likely be stopped by the fixed rope, but the sudden shock load could break ribs or dislocate shoulders. At 3:30 a.m., approximately 28,000 feet, Russell stopped climbing. He stood clipped to the fixed rope, not moving forward or backward, just standing. Gerald climbed back down to him and physically pushed him from behind. Russell started moving again. This pattern repeated every 15 to 20 minutes. At 5 a.m., they reached the south summit at 28,700 feet. The south summit is a false peak. It looks like the top from below, but the true summit is still visible beyond it, connected by a narrow ridge. Dawn was breaking, revealing the final ridge to the true summit. A narrow, exposed traverse with sheer drops of thousands of feet on both sides. The Hillary Step, a near vertical rock face that climbers must ascend using fixed ropes, was visible along the ridge. Russell collapsed onto the snow at the south summit. He sat slumped forward, his head hanging down. His words were slurred and barely intelligible when he tried to speak. The guide crouched beside him and performed a coordination test. He held up fingers and asked Russell to count them. Russell's count was wrong. The guide asked Russell to stand and walk in a straight line. Russell stood but immediately stumbled sideways before catching himself. These were clear signs of cerebral edema, fluid building up in Russell's brain, causing it to swell and press against his skull. The condition would only worsen with continued exposure to altitude. The guide stated firmly that Russell had high-altitude cerebral edema and needed to descend immediately or he would die. There was no ambiguity in his statement. This wasn't a precaution or a recommendation. It was a medical emergency. Gerald gripped Russell's shoulders and pulled him to a standing position. They were an hour behind schedule, but the summit was visible, less than 500 vertical feet above them. Gerald calculated they could reach it in 90 minutes and be descending by 6:45 a.m. He stated they were continuing. The guide made a decision. He used his radio to contact base camp and reported the situation. He stated clearly that Russell was showing definite signs of cerebral edema, that he had recommended immediate descent, and that Gerald was refusing. He stated he was attempting to take Russell down. Gerald physically positioned himself between the guide and Russell, blocking the descent route. The guide realized he was dealing with someone beyond reason. The guide spoke directly to Gerald. He stated that he was descending, that they needed to follow him immediately, and that if they continued upward, they would die. He waited for a response. Gerald turned away and pulled Russell to his feet. He began moving Russell toward the ridge, leading to the summit. The guide stood at the south summit for approximately 3 minutes, watching them move away. Then he began descending alone. The guide would later state in his formal testimony that he knew he was leaving 2 men who would almost certainly die. He also knew that attempting to physically force them down against their will was impossible at that altitude. He barely had enough strength to get himself down, let alone wrestle with a client who outweighed him. He radioed base camp again at 5:20 a.m. and reported that he was descending alone and that Gerald and Russell were continuing toward the summit despite his warnings. Gerald and Russell continued toward the summit. The traverse from the south summit to the Hillary Step is along a knife-edge ridge. In places, it's barely 3 feet wide, with drops of 8,000 feet to the left and 10,000 feet to the right. Fixed ropes run along this section, but they're anchored only every 50 to 100 feet, meaning a fall could result in a significant pendulum swing into the rock face. Russell's movements had become completely robotic. He would clip his carabiner forward along the fixed rope, take 3 or 4 steps, stop, then clip forward again. He wasn't looking around or responding to anything Gerald said. He was simply following the rope. The climbing assistant who had been hired to help Russell moved ahead and behind him, trying to guide him along the safest line, but Russell seemed barely aware of his presence. If these stories are keeping you hooked, hit subscribe. There's more where this came from. They reached the Hillary Step at 6:40 a.m. The Hillary Step is a near vertical rock face approximately 40 feet tall that climbers must ascend using fixed ropes. It's the final significant obstacle before the summit. Climbers clip into the rope and essentially haul themselves straight up, their feet scrabbling for purchase on the icy rock. The exposure is extreme. There's nothing but air for thousands of feet in every direction. Russell stood at the base of the Hillary Step, looking up at it, but not moving. The climbing assistant clipped into the rope ahead of him and started climbing, demonstrating the technique. Russell watched but didn't follow. Gerald climbed up behind Russell and physically positioned Russell's hands on the rope. Russell began climbing slowly. The ascent took him 12 minutes, roughly 3 times longer than normal. At 7:35 a.m., they reached the summit ridge. The true summit was visible approximately 200 feet ahead along a gentle upward slope. Other climbers were on the summit, taking photos. The route was crowded. At least 20 climbers had summited within the previous hour. At 8:30 a.m., Gerald and Russell reached the summit of Mount Everest at 29,029 feet. Gerald spent 15 minutes taking photographs with multiple cameras and recording video footage. He positioned Russell in various poses, though Russell sat motionless most of the time, unresponsive to questions or commands. They began descending at 8:45 a.m. Gerald had summited 3.5 hours past the safe turnaround time the guide had established. They were now facing a descent of more than 3,000 vertical feet back to the 4th camp, and Russell could barely walk. The descent was catastrophically slow. Russell fell twice in the first 30 minutes. Both times he simply lost his balance on flat ground and collapsed. The climbing assistant and Gerald would haul him back to his feet and point him down the mountain. By 10 a.m., they had reached the south summit. They descended only 330 vertical feet in 90 minutes. At 10 a.m., Russell collapsed on the narrow ridge between the south summit and the main summit. He went down onto his hands and knees, then slumped onto his side. Gerald and the climbing assistant tried to lift him. Russell wasn't unconscious, but his legs simply would not respond to commands from his brain, a clear sign that cerebral edema had progressed to critical levels. Gerald used his radio to call for help. He reached base camp and reported their position and situation. Base camp contacted other expedition teams on the mountain. 3 teams had climbers above their position, but all were on their own descents. Base camp asked those teams if anyone could stop to assist. The response was uniform. Stopping at that altitude to help incapacitated climbers would put their own lives at critical risk. At 28,500 feet in the death zone, rescue is nearly impossible. People don't have the physical capacity to carry or drag another person. Even attempting it means risking oxygen depletion, exhaustion, and death. Gerald and the climbing assistant tried dragging Russell. The effort left both of them gasping for air despite their oxygen masks. The climbing assistant checked his own oxygen supply. He had approximately 45 minutes remaining. He informed Gerald he needed to descend or his own life would be in danger. Gerald told him to leave one of his oxygen bottles. They continued descending. The storm system was moving in earlier than forecasted. By 10:45 a.m., clouds were beginning to build from the west. Visibility was still reasonable, but the wind was increasing. Gerald continued trying to move Russell. He would drag him a few feet, rest while gasping for air, then drag him a few more feet. At 11:30 a.m., the storm hit with full force. Visibility dropped from miles to less than 10 feet within minutes. Wind speeds exceeded 70 miles per hour, strong enough that climbers had to crouch low to avoid being knocked off the ridge. Snow began falling horizontally, driven by the wind. Gerald tried his radio but got only static. Either the radio had failed in the cold, or the storm was blocking the signal. By 12:15 p.m., Russell stopped breathing entirely. Gerald felt for a pulse at Russell's wrist through his thick gloves, but couldn't detect one. He pulled off his glove to try again with his bare hand, a catastrophic decision at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. He checked Russell's neck for a carotid pulse. He found nothing. Russell was dead. Gerald, now alone and disoriented in whiteout conditions, attempted to descend. He clipped into the fixed rope and began moving downward. Gerald made it approximately 200 feet down from where Russell lay, then he stopped. Another climber descending behind him later reported seeing a figure clipped to the fixed rope, slumped forward and motionless. Gerald's oxygen supply had been exhausted. Without supplemental oxygen at 28,500 feet, death occurs within 1 to 3 hours. By 3 p.m., he was dead from a combination of hypoxia, hypothermia, and exhaustion. His body remained clipped to the fixed rope, suspended in a seated position. The storm continued through the evening of May 18th and into May 19th. On May 20th, conditions improved enough for teams to assess the situation. A recovery team consisting of experienced high-altitude climbers reached the ridge where Russell and Gerald had died. Both bodies were located exactly where they'd last been seen. Russell was found at 28,650 feet, lying near the fixed rope. Gerald was 200 feet below at 28,450 feet. The recovery team determined that recovery was not feasible. At that altitude, moving bodies requires extraordinary effort and risk. The team would have to risk their own lives to retrieve remains, and the physical effort required would likely result in additional deaths. Russell's death was attributed primarily to cerebral edema, with contributing factors of oxygen depletion and hypothermia. Gerald's death was attributed to hypoxia and hypothermia after his oxygen supply was exhausted. Contributing factors for both deaths included delayed descent, well past established turnaround times, continued ascent despite clear medical symptoms requiring immediate evacuation, and inadequate preparation for extreme altitude mountaineering. A private memorial service was held in Colorado, attended by family and close friends. The guide who descended alone submitted a detailed incident report to the expedition company. The company made no public comment on the deaths or any resulting policy changes. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.